Then, of course, there's the Wisconsin idea, and that is more about the flagship campus of Madison, taking the ideas that are coming straight out of there and higher learning and apply it to our legislature and apply it to creating better policy. Then we have Wisconsin's technical colleges, which are extremely innovative, some of the first ever developed anywhere in the nation of this kind. Wisconsin's first normal school, which is a school for educating teachers, opened in Platteville in 1866. And I think it's important to note that public funding for public education is a public service. Too often I'm in discussions where we talk about finding creative ways to fund public education. You know, there's a business that's willing to generously donate their used materials or old machinery or some funding to keep the ag program or the tech ed program going because they know that will directly feed into their needs. And, you know, I don't disagree with that, and I appreciate people's generosity. I think their hearts are definitely in the right place. But there's a real danger here when we're not publicly funding public education, because it is important that we keep public education prominent as a public service of creating good citizens and people who can engage in the community on all levels. And finally, it's important, if you didn't know, Wisconsin's Constitution includes the right to a free and appropriate public education for all students, ages 4 through 20. So, our schools are fantastic. Wisconsin is tied for second in ACT scores. This is just from this past year. Wisconsin has one of the highest high school graduation rates at 87.5%. Wisconsin is ranked number 10 for talent in the workforce, according to the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And 86% of our rated schools in K-12 meet expectations or better. Only 4% fail to meet expectations. Those are statistics straight out of DPI. Unfortunately, I hear a lot of rhetoric that's negative about public schools. I serve in the assembly, and on the assembly floor, I can't count the amount of times that I've heard that our public schools are failing. And I don't think that our public schools are failing, but I do think it's important to be honest about some of the challenges we have, so that when we do hear rhetoric like that, we understand those challenges and we can counter them effectively. So the 2 points I wanted to make here is, first of all, that yes, we do spend a significant amount of our state general purpose revenue on K-12 education. Now, general purpose revenue is not the entire budget, but it is sort of that large pot of money where lots of different things are funded out of. And so we spend 34.4% of our state GPR on K-12 education. And another issue which is making headlines is that Wisconsin has the largest achievement gap between Black and white students in the nation. And that's true. And that is a very serious concern. In terms of the amount that we spend on our schools, I found this fascinating. The NEA ranked schools and how much they spend per capita, state and local government capital spending for public K-12 schools. And if you notice, Wisconsin is way down here at number 44. So if you hear criticisms that Wisconsin spends too much on our K-12 education, the first challenge I would encourage you to make is, aren't our kids a priority? And the second is that we really are not spending above and beyond compared to other states. Then talking about the achievement gap. So first of all, it's important to note that Wisconsin is increasingly diverse. And just at this point, I also want to add that a lot of the information I'm about to give you is really in-depth. I'm going to go through it quickly. I got a lot of these slides straight from the DPI website, and so if you want more information, feel free to ask later. But basically right here we can see that the Hispanic population in particular has grown at an exponential rate in Wisconsin. However, students of color are more likely to attend a low-performing school. And so while we know that the majority of our schools are very successful, and we only have 4% of our schools which fit in the failed to meet expectations category, if you look at the racial breakdown, here this blue is African American or Black students, and that is the majority of students in failing schools are African American. And so it is important to note it's not necessarily, what I want to say is that you have to be very careful about the correlations that you are deriving between race and achievement. Because here on the next slide, you will also see that poverty in Wisconsin is growing. And this is actually supposed to be an interactive map, so I apologize. It seems that it's not working that way. But if it were working, you would see the proportion of students on free and reduced lunch starting in 2001, and then it would get redder and redder and redder, and it would actually illustrate that from 2001 we had about 21% of our students on free and reduced lunch across the state. Illustrated by each district here. And by the time we get to 2012, it's 43%. That is an incredible increase in free and reduced lunches. And of course, that reflects income in our families across the state, an increase of 22% in just 10 years. And then this is probably the most important graphic in this whole presentation, because it shows just how clearly poverty impacts achievement. So if you look to the left here, and obviously in this upper quadrant, we have high poverty, because on the left here is free and reduced lunch. So we're getting up into the higher percentages of free and reduced lunch. High poverty and low performing schools, because all of the pink ones are failed to meet expectations. And then as you move down the trajectory and finally end up where we have low poverty and high performing schools, it becomes so clear that poverty does play a factor in achievement. And I've often heard it's not just the achievement gap, it's the opportunity gap. And if we would start thinking about the lack of opportunities that students have when they come to school and what we can do to mitigate those circumstances on a healthcare level, on a societal level, and then when they do get to school, also wrap around on services, longer school days, summer school, those are all proven methods to help students of poverty achieve. But you'll see that all of our policies really are moving pretty far away from that. And so to criticize students of race or students of poverty for not achieving is simply not fair. You'll hear, of course, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but I would say that a lot of these students don't even have bootstraps to pull themselves up by. So now we move on to the very basics of school finance. And I will say that I am a teacher. I taught in the Wausau School District for about 8 years. I have my master's degree. And then getting elected a year and a half ago has been a huge learning curve for me on just what basic school finance is. So this is a very quick rundown, but please understand that it's very complicated. I'm sure many of the listeners have a deeper understanding than I do, but if it is confusing, it's okay. It's a long road to understand Wisconsin school finance. So first of all, the basics of revenue. So money coming in is about $10.8 billion, and it's important that you understand where that money comes from. We're talking about public schools now. So you can see that a large chunk, 44%, comes from state funding. A large chunk, almost the other half, comes from local property tax funding. And then there's about 9% from the feds. And a small amount is basically fundraisers and booster clubs and other things like that. So, school funding. If we start with the revenue limit, and that is how much money a school can spend per child, that is set by the state and has been locked in by the state in a largely arbitrary manner, because it's different for each school district. So we start with the revenue limit, and then we subtract the amount of money that the state pays to the schools through the equalization aid formula. Then what you're left with is the amount of property tax that the school district is allowed to levy. Outside the revenue limit, there are some categorical aids, largest being special needs funding, ELL funding, high-cost transportation, sparsity aid. Those are categorical aids. Also, federal funds come into play. Again, special needs is largely funded federally, and then again, the other revenue booster clubs and the like. So revenue limits have been cut, and this is a dramatic illustration. First of all, what I want you to notice is the zero line is if we didn't add any additional revenue limit per pupil. So this graph illustrates the change in per pupil revenue over time. So you can see that here in 1993 to 94, we were adding an additional $200 per pupil. And obviously the trajectory went up, and we were adding more and more per pupil each year. You may say that sounds like spending a lot of money, and you will hear that argument that, oh, we were spending so much money and it just kept increasing and increasing. That's true, but it's also important to understand how much the cost of educating children is increasing. We hear a lot about the cost of healthcare, and that has definitely affected our schools. Not to mention fuel, transportation, and other things like that. So then here we get to basically Act 10 and the budget repair bill. And in 2010, 2011, not only did we not continue to fund our students with, or allow our schools to levy as much, to spend as much with the revenue cap, but we put it so low that our schools actually were spending about $550 less than they traditionally had. Then in the next year, it evened out to be equal. So we were operating at a deficit of negative $550 per child. And then it went up $75 for the next 2 years, the next 2 budget cycles. Now, how that plays out in reality, here we see nominal dollars, so how much money we are actually spending, which did decrease with Act 10, but compared to adjusted dollars for inflation, we have seen very little increase in spending in schools. Another thing to consider is when we talk about those federal funds, which are about 9%, the funding there has dramatically dropped. Services have dropped about 10 percentage points since 2000, the 2001 budget, and this illustrates bilingual bicultural, or ELL, and special education funding from the feds. So how that plays out then actually in our schools and in the classrooms, I think this is really fascinating. In 2009-10, we were already cutting teachers. We dropped about 600 teachers that year. We lost about 358 aides. We gained about 25 administrators, and we gained over 200 support staff. The next year, we cut almost 700 teachers. We cut aides again. We cut some administrators that year, and we cut support staff. And then again, the budget repair bill came, and it's a drastic cut. 1,600, more than 1,600 teachers in one school year, 812 aides, 175 administrators, and 785 support staff. Now, if you put these 3 years together and cumulatively how many teachers we have lost, we're looking at more than 3,000 teachers that we have cut during the Great Recession, if you go back to '08. And so the net result then, of course, is that we have a lot more stress in our schools. We have a lot larger class sizes. We have a lot fewer programs. And when it's spread out over all the districts, it may not be so very tangible, but I think it would be hard to deny that there are these effects in our schools. So the final word on funding, just to wrap it up, is that Wisconsin has cut $1.2 billion from public schools since 2010. All 424 public school districts across the state are forced to spend 1.5% of their state funds on 2R independent charter schools that operate only in Milwaukee and Racine. And Wisconsin is spending $420 million public dollars on private education in this budget. And just a bit of a breakdown of that is $30 million goes to income tax cuts for parents sending their children to private schools. That tax cut disproportionately helps those with higher incomes. And of course, the statewide expansion of vouchers, which is $6,442 per student. And Robin Voss, leader of the Assembly GOP, is calling for a voucher in every backpack. Superintendent Tony Evers has estimated that would cost $1.9 billion. And if we really did have a voucher in every backpack, and there are a lot of nuances in the way this is playing out. Of course, I assume that most of you have been paying attention to this whole debate and realize that the majority of students who took part in the statewide expansion of vouchers already were attending their public schools, I think at a rate of about 80%. And I've also found it very interesting that many of those voucher schools charge significantly less for their actual tuition for paying students than they get for the voucher program. Now, the voucher program apparently is prorated to be the cost of education, but I'm quite certain that they are getting very close to that $6,500. And for instance, there is a voucher school in Wausau. For elementary school, they charge only $2,500 per student, and for high school, they charge $4,500 per student, roughly. So that means they are making between $4,000 and $2,000 per child on the voucher program. And that's not something that's been widely talked about, and I think it really needs to be. I had a conversation today with a friend who mentioned, you know, Mandy, I'm hearing about all these terrible bills, and I didn't really work them into my presentation, but I think this is the best point to bring them up. There are some really very serious bills that we stopped this past session. I think they're pretty well known, but just to touch on them, the special needs vouchers bill, which I'm certain will come back again, and that, of course, was public funding for private schools only for special needs students, and they are not mandated to follow federal laws regarding special needs students. There's also sort of this faux accountability bill. There was a set of them. It was actually a series of about 20 drafts, and several editions of those drafts had very serious accountability measures or punishments, really, for our public schools. In particular, Milwaukee public schools. There was a version that would have shut down every single public school in Milwaukee public schools. And of course, this is also setting up for the results of what happens with Smarter Balance. And I'm extremely concerned how those numbers will be twisted when we have this new testing system, and we're not really sure what will be happening and the results of those. And then finally, I mentioned here on this slide the 2R independent charter schools that operate only in Milwaukee and Racine. There was a bill to expand that program statewide. It would have converted all of our charter schools across the state away from ones that are controlled by our schools. Like here in Wausau, we have, they're called instrumentality charter schools, and they're connected to the school district and they're controlled by the school board. Well, the control for those charter schools would have been taken away from all those local school boards, as well as the funding, and it would have been put directly on the backs of our public schools without their say. So for example, here in Wausau, we already spend $767,000 each budget cycle for the independent charter schools. If we had expanded that statewide and converted all of those charter schools to be independent charter schools, that would have increased exponentially. I don't even have estimates, but again, that's 1.5% of the state funding that Wausau gets. So multiply that times at least 2 or 3, and then extrapolate that for 424 board districts across the state. It's an incredible proposition and would have been so very, very damaging. And so I am actually very proud of the things that we were able to stop this past session. Another important point is that we're not truly supporting adequate education opportunities for all. And this chart shows school districts that went to referendum just this past spring. Now, I'm on the Rural Schools Task Force, and I'm hearing all sorts of really heartbreaking stories about schools that can't offer foreign language, they can't offer technical education, when the community is crying for more welders. They can't offer ag when it's a rural area, and everyone knows that we want to be supporting our local farmers and getting students trained into agriculture. So this is a list of districts that went to referendum. We have an unprecedented number of districts that went to referendum for operating expenses, which means just to keep the doors open. Some of them very prominently said that they were going to have to shut down. Oakfield is on this list, and the referendum did pass, but they clearly said that they would have to shut down if they didn't pass their referendum. Toma did not pass their referendum. And I don't know about the fallout of that yet. I haven't had an opportunity to reach out to them in person. But then there are also other districts, and it's important to understand many of these districts serve economically depressed areas. And so for those communities to pass increased property taxes is extremely ironic, since we just spent millions and millions of dollars in our state legislature to pass property tax relief. But really all that we're doing is we're underfunding our public schools. We're giving property tax relief directly from the legislature to our property taxpayers, but then we're forcing our local school districts to increase those property taxes, so they end up being the bad guys and we get reelected. And that's one of the most frustrating dynamics that I've seen. So it's about the kids and more. So often we talk about the kids, and it is about the kids, but it's about more than just our kids. It's about workforce training, and our business communities need to understand just how important this is. If we don't have tech ed and you're a manufacturing firm and you're crying out for welders, you need to understand why we don't have tech ed in some of our K-12 schools anymore. Also, it's important that Wisconsin has twice the incarceration rates as Minnesota, and of course that's related to education and economic opportunities. Of the millions in tax breaks Wisconsin has passed in this session, has it actually led to high property taxes for those who voted to keep their school doors open? For those school districts that went to local referendum, are they actually paying higher property taxes? I'm working on getting this research done, but if you happen to be in one of those districts, I think that is a fascinating question to ask, and I'd be happy to support whatever you find there. Also, when you have conversations with people, here in central Wisconsin, I feel like most Republicans wouldn't really agree with defunding public education. And so they kind of look at me a little bit cross-eyed when I say these things. But if you need validation, go to this website, Wisconsin GOP 2013 State Convention Resolutions as adopted. And I'll just read it. Therefore, be it resolved that the Republican Party of Wisconsin in convention assembled urges that parents of school-age children be given vouchers or tax credits designed to give all parents equal freedom of choice in education without regard to their financial means. Translate, millionaires should be able to receive vouchers. Calls for the state legislature to eliminate funding of 4-year-old kindergarten. Urges legislation adopting alternative standards for teacher licensing that do not require a degree in education or student teaching experience. opposes the adoption and implementation of Common Core standards as well as the International Baccalaureate curriculum in the Wisconsin school system, and supports allowing properly trained adult staff to be armed in public schools. And of course, it's important that there are alternatives. And when I was creating this PowerPoint, I very much wanted to put there are democratic alternatives, because these are all democratic proposals right now. But I do want to leave it open because these need to be bipartisan, even if the Democrats become in the majority, because they're simply the right thing to do, at least some version of it. I didn't attach bills because this session is basically over. But these will be revised next session, and I'd be happy to give you more information. So one particularly targeted towards rural schools is increased varsity funding, and that just means if you have 10 students per square mile or less, you would be eligible to receive more funds. There's an old program called TEACH, and that had to do with technology, implementation, hardware, training of staff, and actually getting devices. It's basically run its course and it's defunded at this point. So we, the Democratic caucus, have proposed a Teach 2 version to help with technology. There's a rural school teacher loan forgiveness bill, and I'm the lead on that. It would help teachers with their student loans if they're willing to go to a rural school district. I think we cannot leave wraparound services off the table. It's so critical that we address mental health, physical health, before and after school programming and summer school programming. And there's another bill, a very specific bill, that would call for 30% reimbursement for special education. Okay, and then there's also the fair funding proposal. Again, I won't go through all this because it's quite detailed, but I feel very strongly that this is, at the very least, a strong beginning point for where we should be taking school funding in Wisconsin. And, you know, school funding sounds kind of boring and dry, and it is in some ways. It's finance, but it's also the means to provide those opportunities for our children, because if we don't have the financial resources, our district simply can't survive, and they can't provide the appropriate level of opportunity for our children. So the real quick on this is that it would be $3,000 per pupil across the state of Wisconsin. And right now we actually have districts that pay nothing or that receive nothing from the state, largely because that's based on property tax value. Okay, and why should our tax dollars fund public over private schools? Just again to kind of take this back to the sky view, public schools educate every child. In all of these privatization programs that I've been talking about, they have the ability to censor and screen, and you may talk to schools and they may say, no, we don't do that, we don't refuse any child, but the fact is that they have the right to. So even if they individually do not, most of them do, even if they deny it, because when it comes to behavioral students with high behavioral needs, when it comes to very expensive cognitively disabled students, those students can cost $40,000, $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 or more just for 1 year to educate them, and that becomes such a burden on private schools that they generally turn those students away. Now, of course, it's a burden on public schools too, but we are required to educate all students in the public schools, so we do. Public schools must follow Federal Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and there are hundreds of provisions that go into IEPs and various other mechanisms, and they can be time-consuming, that's for sure, but they have all been developed to protect special needs students. And because they are some of our most vulnerable students, they need extra protection. And so to publicly fund a private school education and take away all those protections is really a step in the wrong direction, really a sad state of affairs. And finally, public schools are accountable. We have all sorts of new mechanisms for accountability at the teacher level, at the school level, and at the district level. And they are locally controlled. We elect school boards who have open meetings and open financial records. And these private schools that receive public funding don't have any of those mechanisms. Education is the American dream. Dave Obey was elected to the 85th Assembly District. That's how he got his career started in politics. And so I look to him in a lot of what he's done. And I found this quote by him, and I thought it was really poignant. Experience burned into me the conviction that access to education ought to be based on how much you are willing to learn and how hard you are willing to work, not on how many dollars your family has in their bank account. And from my perspective in the legislature, I am truly concerned that we are moving to a stratification of our education system, where if you can afford to send your child to a good private school, and maybe add some subsidies or get the appropriate tax breaks or tax incentives, you will. And then what's left will be students that don't have the means, don't know how to navigate the system, have such high special needs. And we won't be living the American dream anymore. So what can you do? There are lots of things that you can do. And I really, first of all, appreciate that you're listening in, because this is such an important discussion. I know lots of people are working on this issue in many ways, and I appreciate your time. So first of all, you can advocate. You have plenty of information just from this PowerPoint alone. You can write letters to the editor. You can talk to friends. You can speak out on social media. You can run for office. I thought that was pretty crazy when somebody first approached me, but obviously it's worked out well for me. I am glad. Currently, I am the only public school teacher who's been in the classroom in the past decade that's serving in the entire legislature. And we have no administrators, we have no superintendents, we have several school board members who are wonderful advocates, but we really need more people who understand public education and what it takes to really educate our kids. And even if you don't want to run for the state level, certainly we need more good people in our school boards and our county boards and our city councils, and that all makes a difference. And support your candidate. Do some research, find a good candidate or two, learn their positions, and then hold them accountable. Too often I go to these meetings where my colleagues are saying, oh, I support public education, and then they turn around and they vote for statewide expansion of vouchers, or they refuse to support the simple bills that I listed, like increased varsity aid or things like that. And so they're simply not held accountable. Everybody nods and says, oh, how nice, they support public education, but they're not really supporting it in any meaningful, tangible way. And of course, get involved in campaigns. It does matter. And with that, I'd just like to wrap up. I did not include my contact information, but I'm going to tell it to you now, and I hope that there's an easy means to communicate it with everyone. If you do have further questions, especially about bills, feel free to call or email my office. I have a staff member, his name is John, and my phone number is 608-266-0654, and my email, my legislative email is rep.wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, at legis.wisconsin, all spelled out, .gov. And yes, I would be happy to answer questions at this point. Thank you very much for tuning in. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to just go back and look through some of the notes here of what people have written in. And here we have Martha Pincus said Milwaukee has the highest or one of the highest segregated rates in the nation as well. True. Which is another really valid point, actually, just that, you know, Milwaukee is a great place, and a lot of the education systems are really working very well towards some of the schools, and I'm so impressed. But there certainly are a fair share of problems as well. And so when you talk to people around the state, it's really important to just say, you know, why are we taking the Milwaukee system, which does have problems. We have really low graduation rates. We have this high segregation issue. There's this racial and poverty issue. Why are we taking those issues and exporting that system statewide? Because the rest of Wisconsin generally is doing very well. Why would we take vouchers and expand them statewide? We don't have the same issues as Milwaukee. It doesn't make sense. And then it says, are some of the schools in increased free lunches, our association with the recession, are those schools historically better performing than the urban schools that have been in poverty for a much longer time? That is a great question. I am not sure if I can really accurately say that between rural and urban schools and poverty, that poverty is exactly the same. I think that they both bring their challenges. When we have rural schools that have high poverty, they tend to have a real lack of access to services, and that's a problem, obviously. Transportation becomes a huge barrier, and just a lack of programming generally in the rural areas that people can take advantage of. On the other hand, in the urban areas, I think that safety becomes much more of an issue, and that is obviously very serious. And also in Milwaukee in particular, we see so much shifting of schools, because you'll try one school and you won't feel safe, or you won't be happy with the results, and you switch to another school and another school. And we actually have some schools which are bribing students to come for the third Friday count so they can get the funding. And then maybe they try a virtual school, and they're trying all these different things. And really what they need most of all is just a strong community. They need stability. And that destabilization of relationships and structure for the child is one of the most destructive things that I see coming out of the voucher system. And then Martha said, does anyone bring up funding parochial schools? Is there not supposed to be a separation of church and state? There was a lawsuit that went to the state Supreme Court about the separation of church and state. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but we lost that. And since then, the majority of voucher schools have like 90% or more of their students through the voucher program. And that is a valid question. Unfortunately, we have challenged that and generally lost. I don't know that it's something that we should completely give up on. It may be worth challenging again, but there are other really valid points to challenge the voucher program. Then the next one says, in Milwaukee are charter schools either with MPS, UWM, or so there's a variety of charter schools. First of all, there are 3 different voucher systems throughout the state. There's Milwaukee, Racine, and then the statewide program. They all have some different requirements and funding levels. And similar with charter, there are 3 different types of charter systems. One's instrumentality, that's the most closely connected to the school district. Then there's non-instrumentality, which is sort of a hybrid. And then where the teachers aren't actually employed by the school district, although they're affiliated with it. And then there is the independent, where, yes, they are authorized by a different entity, but they don't actually have much control. Why don't we put the WITS GOP on the front pages? That is a great question. In Milwaukee, you have Fuller, who with his wife and some other pillars want privatization because they led the private school movement. Yeah, something I really left out here is the amount of money that we see flowing into this movement. In the past 10 years, there's been $10 million spent on behalf of school privatization on elections, directly related to elections. So there are groups that very specifically advocate only for school privatization. There are 3 lobbyists that are in the Capitol building constantly who have very strong ties. A former assembly leader who actually faced felony charges for campaigning on his office time, Scott Jensen, is one of the leaders of the pro-voucher, pro-privatization movement. And he wields a lot of power. And same with Jim Bender. He is constantly advocating for school privatization. He's a lobbyist. I asked him what his background was, and he said politics. He had worked in the building as a staffer and media. And I would say that that is generally the background of all these lobbyists, and it's truly, truly sad to see the amount of power that they wield and the lack of true knowledge that they have about education. They don't have an education background. Most of them have spent little to no time in a classroom, and yet they are changing policy that affects thousands and thousands of people. We have 870,000 public school children in the state of Wisconsin. Then it says, why can't the money follow the students if they go to non-public schools instead of allowing the money to stay at the private school when the student leaves either due to not being educated or asked to leave? That's a good question. I think that would really show the disparity of how our schools are funded. Would local control lead to higher property taxes under the proposed legislation? Good question. I will assume that you're talking there about the fair funding proposal, which is right here. Fair funding, it's important to note that it's not only $3,000 per pupil. There's a poverty weighting and also ELL weighting of an extra 30% funding per child, and it does hold all school districts harmless, and there is an initial infusion of about $400 million, but then it holds property taxes level. So we would need to find those startup funds, $400 million. Keep in mind we're spending $420 million public dollars on private education in just this budget alone. So we would need to find the $400 million to allocate to getting this up and running. But then once we do that, it does hold the line on property taxes. How can the urban and rural schools work together for all the children of Wisconsin? Great question, Martha. I'd be happy to have a continuing conversation about that. I unfortunately hear some division there. I serve on the Rural Schools Task Force. I serve on the Education Committee, and I'm also the ranking Democrat on the Urban Education Committee. And in the end, I don't think that there are all that many differences. But unfortunately, I hear people getting a little jealous of one or the other, and I really think we do need to find ways to work together and understand that we are affecting all children here. Something I'm working on with school districts is just to get them to understand, because so often the administrators of school districts, they do wonderful jobs and they're so focused on their district and their community and keeping everything moving forward that they don't necessarily see the larger picture across the state. I think it's getting better where they do. But, you know, even if your school district is okay, you are your brother's keeper. And a lot of these little rural districts, they don't have media to talk to. And they're kind of the canaries in the coal mine, because if they really do start shutting down and they're so desperate, they are really bare bones, and many of them are to that. Eventually we will be there for more of our school districts and more of our school districts. And we do need to work together, urban and rural, definitely. Are there stats on how many schools get the money and then the student leaves? That's a great question. There are some statistics through DPI about voucher school student enrollment and if they're used for the third Friday count and then left. I am working on a bill that says you cannot provide monetary or other inappropriate incentives to have a student in their seat for the third Friday count, that you can get penalized for that, because I've heard some horrible stories. But it's difficult to track, and I know that students who start out in a voucher school, by the time, like if they're a freshman in a voucher school, by the time they graduate from high school, the majority of them have transferred out of that original school. By far the majority, and I'm hesitant to say a number, but it was a very high percentage number of how many have left just within the 4 years of high school. So yeah, there's a real issue with instability. Is there a source which shows how much these 2R charter schools measure up student scores against the public schools in the same district? Steve, that also is a great question. So when we look at the testing results in general, we can see that voucher schools slightly underperform public schools, and these 2R charters do actually overperform the public schools. But keep in mind that they only operate in Milwaukee and Racine right now. So it's difficult. They actually get a disproportionate amount of funding to these 2R charters because they get $8,000 per child from the state. And of course, they don't have to accept every child, but they are showing better test results. So that becomes kind of a thorny discussion, but is it really justifiable that we take 1.5% of funding off the top of every single school district across the state to fund these schools? I don't think so. How about getting a staffer to work up a fact page about voucher schools, et cetera, about the disparities of what is told to the public about testing? There has been some really good information. I will say Representative Polk has been our lead in the Assembly for Democrats, and she's put out some really good information from her office. If you get on the DPI website, they have a lot of information. I tried really hard to collate a lot of information here and put it into a PowerPoint that made sense and was something that we could talk about in about half an hour or so, and really pick out the high points and the low points. But it's true, there is so much data, there's so much information, it's almost like there's too much data, honestly, because it's really hard to wade through it all and come up with a meaningful information. But overall, I would definitely say that there are some very important things to keep in mind. For instance, this slide right here, the final word on funding. Now we've got $1.2 billion. That all school districts spend 1.5% of their state funds on 2R independent charters, and we're spending $420 million public dollars on private education. So those are definitely important talking points. So, any further questions?
Well, things seem to be slowing down, and I'd like to thank you so much. Representative Wright, this was fantastic. I'd like to thank everyone for putting up with our technical difficulties. Please join us next week when Mike Wilder will be back from the Wisconsin Voices on expanding the vote. And then on May 15th, we'll have Chris Amity, the Executive Director of the ACLU, also talking about public education and what we can do. The recording and the slides will be up on our website within 24 hours. Thank you again, everyone, for signing in and for your patience with our technical difficulties. Until next week, thank you.
Thank you.